Hey everybody, welcome back to class. It is week 3 and I just want to give you a bit of a video introduction and overview to the week. Let you know where we're going this week in our class, Current Issues in Leadership Studies. So we're off to a good start. Last week we dove further into your particular ideas for your case study projects, and you continue to move along with some of the ideas about leadership, which you probably were familiar with from our previous classes on leadership studies. So this week we're gonna continue to work on the topic for the case study project, and we're gonna start to turn the corner on leadership studies a little bit to get a little more into some of the nuanced and critical areas of leadership studies. So I think hopefully this week, as we get into chapter 5, you're starting to maybe see some new ideas about leadership, or at least some ideas that aren't quite as familiar as some of the ones we had, like transformational and charismatic and situational. I think up to this point it's been a good review, and from this point on now, some of the things you're going to be reading are hopefully a little more challenging in terms of your understanding of leadership and leadership studies, and are some new areas for you as well. So what I want to do in this video is I want to kind of go over those two big blocks of the week. I want to talk about the project and your final topic, and then I want to talk about kind of big picture on some of these areas, or what are called the perspectives on leadership in context. All right, so I'm going to go over some of that as well. So not an exhaustive lecture, but just an overview so I can kind of hit some of the highlights here and maybe give you some examples. All right, so let's talk about the case project and what's due for that this week. So this week I need you to pick a topic, and I know it's challenging. You guys have a lot of great ideas, a lot of areas of interest, but for sake of keeping this thing moving along and finishing it within a reasonable amount of time, I need you to land on a topic this week. Now, I saw a lot of good ideas last week. Let me just kind of give you some general thoughts and general ideas on focusing here and picking one. Remember, in research, with any topic like this, a good project is a done project, right? So in as much as we all want to change the world with our phenomenal research ideas, you have to pick something that's doable, that you can actually chip away at and complete. So I want you to pick something that's doable and that's manageable. So in as much as these larger topics are wonderful and somebody needs to address them, for this project I need you to kind of find a manageable slice of reality that you can actually research. Now, you might be a little bit confused because initially I said, well, find a large societal issue that you can tackle. And that's true. I want you to be thinking about the big picture, but for your project, you have to be able to find a very researchable and manageable area to look at that. So a case study, it's looking at a larger, important phenomenon, but it's doing so within the context of a specific time and place and event that you can actually research as an example of that larger phenomenon, right? So you're not going to be able to research everything that has to do with it. You can give some big picture context, but for your actual data collection and what you're going to speak about what you're going to give a better picture of, sorry, I had a little brain freeze there for a second, is a specific instance and example of that phenomenon. All right, so you may be concerned about, human trafficking. You may be concerned about millennials leaving the church, but you have to narrow that down into an area where you can actually do some research. So where is some human trafficking happening? Where are some millennials leaving the church? And then dive into that as your example that you're going to use for your case study. Okay, again, we already said case studies are not necessarily generalizable, so what you learn isn't going to solve all the problems, but this is perhaps an instance of where somebody did make a difference, where there were some changes, some positive changes taking place, or where you gain some insight into a particular mindset. So let me give you a good example here, and this actually came up from a student's project where I think you can kind of see this winnowing project and a winnowing process and going from large glittering generalities to meaningful and researchable specifics, all right? So there's a student that wants to look at students' attitudes towards Christian higher education. Okay, now that's a great topic, So what are younger millennial age students' attitudes towards Christian education? Why would they choose Christian education as opposed to just going to a secular university, right? That's a great topic. It can be useful in a lot of different contexts for marketing and for student services professionals and all those sorts of things. Now that's a large question, right? That's pretty vague and pretty general, right? Christian students in universities, right? So what we have to do then is winnow it down to one specific instance, to one set of Christian students, to one particular Christian university, right? So what they're going to do is they've found one particular university where they can get access to the types of data that they're going to need. Now remember, in a case study, you're looking at lots of different data. So you're not just doing interviews or those kinds of things, surveys, but you're kind of getting data from lots of different sources. So they're going to look at one particular university, they're going to find one group of students, they're going to find one group of faculty, they're going to find one set of documents that talk about the school, and they're going to draw a case based on that particular instance of Christian students in universities, right? So they're going from this large generality, to the real meaningful specific that can actually focus as a case study of this particular phenomenon. And so they'll be able to write it up, they'll be able to get access to a specific group of students and all the stakeholders, right? So you want to look at all the different stakeholders involved. And then come up with, well, this is how this was the attitude of this particular group of students and how they perceive Christian education and why they did. And this is what these faculty thought about Christian education. This is what they thought about their students and their attitude towards Christian education. And this is what this particular school said about it. Okay, so that's an example of how you go from this large, global, abstract question to a real specific case study where you can talk about it in ways where you can actually, do the research and whatnot. All right. So as you're thinking about your topic this week, and as you're narrowing it down to one particular topic, I want you to be thinking about the manageability and the doability of your project. Where can I get access to an example of the case that I want to do this? So it's not enough just to come up with an interesting idea. Now you have to start thinking more practically. And again, as a researcher, as you guys kind of move on your academic career, you always want to be asking the question, can I actually get access to the data I need to do this research? Because we can ask lots of interesting questions. There's a lot of great research questions out there that we can conceive of wanting to know the answer, and that's good. But what we have to do is say, all right, is there a thin slice of that reality that I can actually make a difference in? So you're not going to solve the big picture right away. You have to do so through these smaller, manageable, incremental bits of research where you can actually prove and verify that, the phenomena did or did not take place. So that's what you're doing for part of the week, is you're coming up with a specific question. And I'm asking you to answer some of these questions too. So how do you narrow it down to a specific? What's the population? Who are the people that you're going to actually need to talk to? What is the organization or the larger social context that you're going to actually have to do the research in? So that's our goal for the project this week, is to narrow it down and discuss specifically who you're going to have to talk to, who you're going to have to observe, what organization or societal instance are you going to have to collect data from. Now, the second main objective this week is to look at leadership from a contextual perspective, right? So what does that mean, contextual perspective? It means we're going to look at leadership beyond some of these specific approaches to leadership that are shown to have positive impact upon followers and organizational performance. But the sort of the underlying approach by which we think about leadership in a larger context, right? So we're kind of doing the opposite here than we're doing for a case study. Our case study, we're going from generalities to specifics. Now we're kind of going from specifics to larger generalities. So the context is the time and the space and the place, right? But it's really going beyond that. This approach really looks at sort of the psychology and the sociology behind how people think about leadership. So they're looking at the psychological perspective and the sociological perspective by which people think about leadership. All right, so there's a few areas within here that there's been some research on that are helpful for you to get your hand around this. The first one is called implicit leadership theory. So what is implicit leadership theory? Implicit leadership theory is this idea that in our heads, right, we all have an idea of what leadership is, right? So you didn't have to take this class, you don't have to read a book in order for you to already have some ideas about leadership. We're forming these ideas about leadership for years, probably from from a young age. We already have ideas about what leadership is. And so implicit leadership theory says, we all carry around these ideas of what leadership is, and because we do so, this will impact what we practice as leaders and what we consider to be effective leadership. So to the degree to which our implicit theories are real, are effective, that will, in a sense, drive the effectiveness of our leadership. So, for example, if you have this implicit idea that leadership that is effective is authoritative and commanding and takes charge and all those sort of things, that's going to be the type of leadership that you tend to practice, right? Now, on the other hand, we also would develop what's called a prototypicality, right, in our mind. So we have this prototype of what we think a good leader is, and we will accept somebody as an effective leader the degree to which they match that prototype that's in our heads, right? So if you've ever been in a situation where a new leader comes in, what's the first thing we're doing? We're kind of evaluating whether or not that person's a good leader, a strong leader, somebody that we're going to trust, somebody that we're going to really give ourselves over to. And so the degree to which they match our implicit theory, right, is sort of the prototypicality. They are a prototype of what we feel is effective leadership in this context. So let's just look in a church context. The degree to which, we accept a new pastor will be the degree to which we feel this new person meets the prototypical requirements of a good pastor, right? So they're a good preacher, are they compassionate, do they have some kind of vision for the church and those sorts of things. So somebody comes along, and let's just say, just extreme example, somebody, comes from business school, and they come in, all of a sudden they've got like charts and graphs and strategy lines and all these sorts of things. We might think, well, that's cool, but that's not exactly what we expect in our pastor, right? We want our pastor to be somebody who hears from God, right? We want our pastor somebody who really understands the Bible and has these experiences with God and can lead us closer to Jesus, right? So it's not that this other one is bad or not really leadership, but it doesn't fit our prototype of what that particular type of leader is. And we do the same thing in business. The degree to which a new CEO or division head is accepted is the degree to which they fit our prototype in our heads of what an effective leader in that role should look like. All right, so again, this is kind of a psychological perspective, but it's also sociological in that together we agree as a people what effective leaders are like. And so oftentimes, you'll have this kind of water cooler chit chat about a new leader and say, yeah, this person doesn't do it for me because this X, Y, and Z, right? And typically those conversations that we're carrying on have to do with prototypicality. This guy or gal does not fit what we feel is going to be an effective leader in this particular context. So a lot of times the jury is out, right? And so we'll often give a new leader the benefit of the doubt, but they have time to prove themselves whether or not they can deliver And maybe they'll break the stereotype. Maybe we'll say, well, we really were expecting a leader like this, but this guy came on a little different. He brought different skills. And so now that kind of changes and challenges our internal schema, right? Our prototype. We have to kind of bend and flex a little bit because we've been challenged. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about in terms of implicit? The textbook also talks about critical views on implicit leadership theories. I'm going to read a little bit. I'm not going to do a whole lot of this, but I'll read a couple sentences that I think are actually germane here. It says this: the flaw, they talk about research into content of implicit leadership theories, highlighted the flaw in the inclusions drawn from some of these research studies. Okay, so again, now we're kind of getting to that point where we're not only looking at the theories, but we're kind of looking at them a little more critical, right? So this is what critical theories are. So again, when you're kind of a newbie in the leadership studies, it's like, hey, I'm just going to learn all these new theories, and this is great, this is going to help me. But we want you as kind of, graduate students finishing this leadership program to really understand sort of what are some of the shortcomings of these approaches as well. Not just rah, this is all good leadership stuff, but I'm a scholar of leadership and I understand, the pros and cons of all these different theories. So the flaw is a relatively firm assumption that many studies that cognitive schema of leaders in general are positive, and particularly so for effective leaders. All right, so again, this kind of gets to this whole positivism in leadership. The fact is a lot of us have a lot of negative schemas about leadership, right? So we don't always look at leadership as this positive thing, but sometimes we look at leadership as a negative thing. Now, we won't come out and say this, right? But deep down inside, when we think about it, we think these leaders are failures, these leaderships are not living up to what they should be. These leaders are not moving the organization or the society forward in a way they should. So it's a bit more of a pessimistic view, if you will, of leadership. Now, again, as Christians, we always hope for the best, work for the best, strive for the best. But again, we're looking at some of the leadership theories in a critical way, and we understand that sometimes we don't always have this positivistic view of leadership. So our implicit theories sometimes can be flawed because they're based upon a positivistic model of leadership. Does that make sense? All right, wrap your brain around that one, people. Let's see, what else do I want to talk about? So I talked about prototypicality, the prototypical leader. This is the idea that leaders will be affected to the degree to which they meet the prototypes that's in our head. And on a practical level, I think this is really helpful for some of us who are trying to break in, trying to be, move up in terms of our management and leadership. Oftentimes there's this idea of dressing for success. And dress for success means, on a surface level, is you want to look like what people expect a leader to look like. So if you're shooting for this job here, you want to dress like the people in that job so that people begin to see you, right? Well, in a larger context, to meet the prototype of what people expect from leadership, you want to begin to behave and act and have the resume, if you will, of what a prototypical leader in that particular industry or context looks like. So if you go in an organization that's kind of buttoned down and very, professional and, kind of data driven, all those sort of things, you can't show up in your flower shirt with your laissez-faire, hey dude, what's going on? Let's chill today. I just want to hang out and get to know y'all. You will not be seen by those people as an effect. Right off the bat, you've got a mark against you because they're looking at you thinking, well, it's all cool that you show up all chill and everything, but we are a very professional, no nonsense kind of organization. So your leadership does not meet the prototype of those organizational members' expectations of what leadership look like. So on a practical level, dress for success, not only physically, but in your attitude and your regard towards people, your attitude towards people. Does it meet their expectations? Sometimes you might say, there's no way I'm not going to meet that prototype. So you might not be a good fit to lead that organization. What else I want to talk about here? Social construction and critical approaches. This is the idea that, leadership is effective to the degree to which it understands the overall social context. And there's an interesting model here on page 106 that talks about different contexts. There's actually 3 different contexts here in this model. called dynamic interaction of different levels of type of context. So there's the cultural context, right? So the national culture and the organizational culture, which we've talked about in different courses. But then there's the institutional context, right? So the history, education, regulation, socialization. And then the immediate context, which has to do with technology and the group and the department. All right, and the research suggests that it's actually this local context that can be the most important for leadership effectiveness and for understanding the context of leadership. So the degree to which you understand the specific local context of that particular field. So let's just say in a church, you come into that context and it's all about technology, it's all about production values and those sorts of things. So I'm kind of thinking like the big church model here. But if you can't speak that speak, walk that walk, understand that particular context, it doesn't matter as much how much you know the larger context or you fit within the larger, national cultural ethos. You got to get those people, right? So it's important to have that sort of departmental level, street level, if you will, knowledge of the context in order for effective leadership. What else do I want to say here? The social construction of leadership. So this kind of gets into this idea that as a society, as a culture, we construct the meaning of leadership. And there's a good sentence here I want to read to you from 108. From this perspective, this is sort of the social construct of leadership. Individuals are seen to create their own reality on a daily basis by way of their interaction with other individuals. Hence, knowledge is a product of social activity and bears the imprint of the social context within which it is constructed. So in other words, the reality that an individual sees is subjective and fluid and is continuously co-constructed through the individual's interaction with the self and context. Wow, now there's a graduate level sentence if I ever heard one. But the idea here is that we together construct what leadership is, and it can be changing and fluid depending on the context. So leadership isn't some real static thing that's out there. Leadership is something that is being constructed as we go along. Now again, this kind of gets into larger worldview and philosophical assumptions about reality, right? So the positive perspective, this is sort of the modern, industrial age paradigm, is that leadership is some real thing that's out there, and if we could just figure it out, we'll do it right. Well, socially constructed view of leadership, along with other things, means that leadership isn't a thing that's out there to be understood, but it is a process, and it's a symbolic meaning system that we co-create together. All right. So I know it sounds kind of weird, maybe a little new agey and fluffy to some of you, but again, you're becoming scholars in leadership. You need to understand this perspective that leadership is not a thing, but it's a process, it's a socially constructed reality. And so we together as a group co-construct leadership and the meaning behind leadership. And I think this is useful. This isn't just really, it's abstract, I know it's philosophical, but I think this approach can be very useful when you're thinking about what leadership is and how people think about leadership and how leadership can be effective. All right, so as you get into your projects, right, let's kind of dovetail these back together. You have to understand that if you're going to come up with a leadership solution to the problem that you're studying, you have to understand that leadership is defined and constructed within the particular context of that organization. So it's not just something, one size fits all, let's just find the right approach and plug it in there, but people create what they feel is effective leadership in context, in situation with other people that are like-minded with them, all right? And then one of the other ideas from this has to do with discourse. And discourse is simply language. And so sort of a discursive view of understanding leadership really focuses in on the language that people use, and it also focuses in on the power and the power systems within leadership. And so these approaches really, a lot of them have to do with power and how do we obtain power, how is language used for power, how do we appropriate it such. A good example I had recently is in a Christian context, how pastors use language for power. And sometimes, you'll hear a pastor or leader talk about them, hearing from God. And it's not so much this divine voice or this supernatural thing, but it's like, they'll tell a story about how the Lord told them this and that. And what are they doing? and again, I'm not saying they're doing it for nefarious, kind of purposes, or, they're not doing it for bad means. They're genuine, but this is a power discourse in many senses, right? They're using this "I heard from God" in order to buffer and to sort of support their argument for whatever it is they're saying. And then we attribute power to these people because say, wow, well, they heard from God. I didn't hear from God. He heard from God, and he's saying thus and so. Therefore, I'm going to attribute power and leadership and authority to this person, all right? So again, it's not necessarily evil, nefarious thing, but again, that's how, as Christians in a church context, we begin to attribute leadership and prototypicality to a particular person is through the language and the type of language they use. And I think that's all about what I'm going to say about that. So let's spend about 15 minutes on this. So I hope this is helpful. Again, very 30,000 level foot view on this. I'm going to let you guys do some discussion on this one this week and talk about these ideas and et cetera, et cetera. So that's all I'm going to say this week. I hope this was helpful. Many blessings to you guys. I look forward to dialoguing and discussing both your projects and helping you see this kind of getting focused in and winnowed in and practical, and then talking about some of these larger abstract ideas of leadership in context. All right, so this should really be an interesting week as we begin to dive into the weeds of this current issues in leadership studies. All right, so blessings to all you guys, and I'll see you online.